Mr. Twiddle makes a muddle. Once upon a time, Mrs. Twiddle got very tired of having Mr. Twiddle in the house. Mr. Twiddle, for goodness sake, go out into the garden and do some work, she cried. Do you know what you've been doing all the morning? You've been trying to smoke your fountain pen and you've put your pipe into the inkstand. And is it you who has stood the poker in the hall stand and put your umbrella in the fender? Oh dear, said Mr. Twiddle, taking his fountain pen out of his mouth and staring at it. I thought my pen tasted a bit funny today. I'll go out and do a bit of gardening, Mrs. Twiddle. You'd better, before you start to poke the fire with your umbrella, said Mrs. Twiddle. Your best one too. Really, Twiddle, why don't you use your brains? Mr. Twiddle could hear by the way that his wife talked that she was not in a very good temper. So he quickly went into the hall, put on his galoshes, tied his old scarf around his neck and ran out of doors. It was cold. What should he do? He poked his head into the shed. It was dark there, but he could see something piled up in a corner. Bless us all, said Mr. Twiddle, staring. I believe those are daffodil bulbs we've forgotten to plant. Dear, what would Mrs. Twiddle say if she knew all those were sprouting away there in the corner instead of growing into nice yellow daffodils for the spring? Now it would be a good thing if I planted them all. That would keep me busy all the morning. So he took his spade and set to work. He dug up the bed and then fetched the bulbs in his barrow. He set them all in nice rows and covered them up gently with earth. Oh, he could work well when he liked, good Mr. Twiddle. He quite enjoyed himself, for the morning was fine. He planted every single bulb, and then he heard his wife calling him. You seem to be working very hard, Mr. Twiddle. I suppose you will be hungry for dinner. Would you like a nice stew with carrots and onions and turnips? Oh, yes, said Mr. Twiddle, feeling quite hungry at the thought. Well, fetch me a few carrots, one large turnip, and some onions from the shed, called Mrs. Twiddle. So Mr. Twiddle went to the shed and looked around. The carrots were in a basket, and so were a few turnips. He put them into a box and looked around for the onions. He couldn't see a single one. He trotted back to the house. There are no onions at all, he said. Rubbish, said Mrs. Twiddle. There are heaps. Go back and look again, Twiddle. So Mr. Twiddle went back and looked again. But he still couldn't see any onions, although this time he looked up at the roof of the shed too, thinking they might be hung there. He trotted back to the house again. I'm sorry, Mrs. Twiddle, but really and truly there are no onions there, he said. Mr. Twiddle, you make me cross, said Mrs. Twiddle. Why, I put the onions in the shed myself. I'll come and show you. Really, I should have thought you knew an onion by now. Mrs. Twiddle went down to the shed with Mr. Twiddle. She looked around and then she stared in surprise. How strange, she said. How very, very strange. Not a single onion here. Where have they all gone? You haven't been eating them, Twiddle, have you? Of course not, said Mr. Twiddle, offended. I don't eat raw onions. Whereabouts did you put them? In that corner, said Mrs. Twiddle, pointing. They were there yesterday, a whole heap of them. Wherever can they have gone to? Mr. Twiddle stared at the corner where his wife was pointing, and a horrid cold feeling came over him. There had been something in that corner this morning, and he had planted it. Dozens and dozens and dozens. What are you looking like that for, Mr. Twiddle? Asked Mrs. Twiddle, staring at him. Have you done something to my onions? Nothing very much, dear, said Mr. Twiddle, trying to smile. I just planted them all, that's all. Planted them, Mr. Twiddle? Said Mrs. Twiddle in the greatest surprise. What did you want to plant onions for? You helped me yourself to pull them up from the ground in the autumn. Why did you plant them again?" "I thought they were bulbs," said Mr. Twiddle. "Well, they are bulbs," said Mrs. Twiddle, "but they are not the sort to plant in the garden." "I thought they were daffodils," said poor Mr. Twiddle. "I've been very, very hard at work all the morning planting them in neat rows. I thought it would be such a surprise for you." "Well, it certainly is a surprise," said Mrs. Twiddle. "And now, Twiddle, I'm afraid if you want any onions in your stew for dinner, you'll have to do some more hard work and dig up those onions again." Poor Mr. Twiddle. He sadly took up his spade and dug up all the dozens and dozens and dozens of onions he had so carefully planted this morning. And wasn't he hungry when he had finished? "I could eat 2 whole stews, I declare," he said to Mrs. Twiddle when he went in. There was a beautiful stew for him, and he did enjoy it. "I'm sorry you had your work all for nothing, Twiddle," said Mrs. Twiddle as she gave him a 4th helping of the stew. "But my dear man, do try and think what you're doing in future." "Oh, I will, Mrs. Twiddle, I will," said Mr. Twiddle, picking up the sugar sifter and shaking sugar all over his stew instead of the pepper. "I've quite made up my mind about that." And he stirred his lemonade with the salt spoon, smiling all over his funny old face. "You just can't stop him from doing things like that, can you?"